Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to give you some recommendations for our Nonfiction November challenges and to tell you what I'll be reading throughout the month. If you missed my announcement video for Nonfiction November, I will link that video for you in the description box and up in the cards. It has all the details, but the gist of that video is that Nonfiction November is a month-long reading initiative during which you're challenged to read a little bit more nonfiction than you ordinarily would. If you currently read absolutely no nonfiction, then you could just read one nonfiction book during November. In fact, that's the only requirement for participation, that you read at least one nonfiction book during the month of November. But if you're like me, if you already regularly read nonfiction, then you could challenge yourself to read a little more. You could read exclusively nonfiction during the month, whatever you want. This is a very self-structured kind of event. We encourage you to do what works for you and your schedule. But if you're looking to add a little bit of extra spice to your Nonfiction November, then every single year I do come up with 4 optional challenges. These are 4 one-word challenges, and they're all words that can be interpreted in a wide variety of ways. This year, our challenge words are fraud, web, capital, and display. And these are words that you can combine to make new challenges. You can select 1 or 2. You can do all 4. You can twist these words to match up with the books that you already wanted to read during the month of November, or you could ignore them entirely if you don't like them. Again, whatever your Nonfiction November ends up looking like will be entirely up to you. If you are interested in doing the challenges though, this is the video for you, because in today's video, I'm going to go challenge by challenge, give you 2 recommendations of books that I think would match these challenge words very nicely, and I'm also going to tell you what 2 books I am going to read to satisfy each of those 4 challenges. And I'm also going to tell you what my reasoning is behind selecting those books, why I think they do a good job of satisfying those challenges. So if you're struggling to pick your books, you're struggling to think up interpretations, hopefully my selections and recommendations will give you some examples of directions you could go in. The first challenge word is fraud, and for this one I immediately thought to recommend one of the wildest, most surreal memoirs I have ever read. It's a book called Sounds Like Titanic by Jessica Chiquetto Hindman. This book was written by a violinist who found a lot of success performing in an ensemble all over the country, except that it was all a lie. It was a sham. She knew how to play violin, but not well enough to do it professionally. So instead, she had to resort to joining this group of people who would travel around while pretending to play, while a CD would play on top of them, so it gave the illusion that they were playing. And this was all a ploy to hawk CDs made by this very shifty composer. Again, it's a very wild story. It reads like a Coen Brothers movie is dissecting the early 2000s. It's surreal, it's funny, I can't believe it exists, but I'm so glad it does. But the other book I recommend for the fraud challenge is a nonfiction book, it's advertised as a nonfiction book, that very likely has some elements of fiction within it, which is why I felt it satisfied this challenge. You've probably heard of this book. It's called Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil by John Berendt. This book is as much a celebration of the city of Savannah, Georgia, as it is a work of true crime, though it does eventually discuss the murder of a young man and the man who was arrested for committing that crime. How I know that there are very likely elements of fiction sprinkled throughout this book is that the author himself admitted in an interview that he took some small liberties with the truth when crafting this narrative, which does raise the question of whether or not any of it can be believed, but I actually find that makes for pretty interesting food for thought as you go through this fascinating, atmospheric story filled with big personalities in Savannah, Georgia. If you haven't read this one already, I highly recommend you do so. I read it myself for Nonfiction November a few years back, and around that time I also watched the movie adaptation, and then I made a whole video comparing this book to the movie adaptation. I'll link that for you below and up in the cards if you want to learn more about this. My first TBR pick for the fraud challenge is definitely going with the most literal interpretation of the word, because I'm planning on reading Confident Women: Swindlers, Grifters, and Shapeshifters of the Female Persuasion by Tori Telfer. We hear so much about male con artists, but there are women who excel at that style of deception as well. And this book tells stories of women throughout history who used treachery to get what they wanted. But I feel like another way you could interpret the word fraud would be picking a book that pushes you way outside of your comfort zone. So my second TBR pick for fraud is going to be a book from within a topic that makes me feel completely out of my depth. I've talked before about not liking physics, but I'm going for it. And in November, I plan on reading Storm in a Teacup: The Physics of Everyday Life by Helen Szyzerski. Now, this is arguably a more approachable book on physics, since it does put the science within the context of our everyday lives, our everyday life activities. I'm hoping that fact will help me wrap my brain around some of these concepts, or maybe I truly will feel like a fraud while I'm reading this. We'll find out. The next challenge is web, and I think one interpretation of this challenge could definitely be anything to do with the internet, since at least once upon a time we referred to it as the web, the World Wide Web. So it could be a book you heard about online, that you were recommended by someone online, or it could be a book about the internet. And that's why I'm recommending Lurking: How a Person Became a User by Joanne McNeill. This is a very thought-provoking book that discusses the development of online communities and all of the positives and negatives associated with them. This is a really great book. I think it'll appeal to anyone who spends a good amount of time on the internet, which I imagine you do since you're watching this video here online. The other book I'm recommending for web, I think, satisfies the challenge in two different ways, because it definitely lends itself to the nature book interpretation that you could go with, but this book also involves a web of interconnected communities, and that's why I thought it was perfect. It's called The Secret Life of Lobsters: How Fishermen and Scientists Are Unraveling the Mysteries of Our Favorite Crustacean by Trevor Corson. This is a book that discusses lobsters and what all we know about them, but it also talks about how the knowledge that scientists have gleaned from studying lobsters has fed into and then changed the behaviors of fishing communities, lobstering communities in Maine. They are interested in the survival of the species, if only for the long-term economic health of their communities. So they actually teamed up with scientists to share observations, share knowledge about lobsters, so they can make better decisions about how to fish for them in a way that's not going to be extremely harmful, or they won't be overfishing. I learned so much about lobsters through reading this book. It's such a fascinating book, but the unexpected bonus was witnessing that kind of cooperation. And then when it comes to what I will be reading to satisfy the web challenge, I was of course always going to pick at least one nature book to satisfy this challenge. The one I chose is called Emperors of the Deep: Sharks, the Ocean's Most Mysterious, Most Misunderstood, and Most Important Guardians by William McKeever. This is, of course, a work of natural history all about sharks, who are an important part of the food web within our oceans. And then back to the internet interpretation of the word web, my other TBR book for this challenge is going to be one I heard highly recommended by NPR. Love me some NPR. It's a book called The Chaos Machine: The Inside Story of How Social Media Rewired Our Minds and Our Worlds by Max Fisher. This is a book all about how social media algorithms have used things that are ingrained within the human psyche to manipulate the way we feel about things we're being shown across social media, and how that has spilled over into the real world. This sounds terrifying, but also extremely necessary. But now let's move on to the third challenge, capital. And both of my recommendations lean more into the political interpretation of that word. Nations are often referred to by the name of their capital, which is how I got there. But the first book I'm going to recommend, it's a book I read before I even started making booktube videos, and I still remember it. It's called Crescent and Star: Turkey Between Two Worlds by Stephen Kinzer. This is a very intelligent breakdown of Turkey's history since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. I got a lot out of this one, but I will also recommend There there she was, The Secret History of Miss America by Amy R. Jetzinger. I tied this one to Capital because it is Miss America, after all, but also this author writes for the Washington Post, which is, of course, the preeminent newspaper in our nation's capital. This book is a history of the Miss America pageant and how women use the pageant as a vehicle to further their careers later on down the line, but it's also a more modern look at the pageant. This author went to a number of different local and state level pageants within the state of Virginia to get a sense of what the circuit looks like in the modern day, and then there's also this question throughout about the pageant's place in the modern world. For a book about a beauty pageant, this one is far from superficial. I still think about this book all the time. For the Capital Challenge, my first TBR pick is going to be a very literal one. I'm planning on reading Havana, a Subtropical Delirium by Mark Kurlansky. This is a history, or a so-called biography, of the capital city of Cuba, and it's written by an author who is famous for writing many microhistories. My second TBR pick goes for the money or finance interpretation of the word capital. I will be reading Digital Gold, Bitcoin and the Inside Story of the Misfits and Millionaires Trying to Reinvent Money by Nathaniel Popper. This is a history of Bitcoin, the relatively new digital currency that's been making the news more and more as time goes on. I understand the concept of Bitcoin, but I don't know anything about how it got started, so I'll have a lot to learn from this. And for the final challenge, display, which is definitely the most visual word out of our four this year, I have to recommend a favorite of mine. It's called Strapless, John Singer Sargent and the Fall of Madame X by Deborah Davis. This is a history of a John Singer Sargent portrait of a socialite and how, when that portrait went on display at the 1884 Paris Salon, it caused such a scandal that the artist had to go back and change an element of the painting. This book is fabulous. I adore it. But also for the word display, since that word definitely conjures up how we as humans interpret the world, since we are very visual creatures, I kind of want to flip that interpretation on its head and recommend one of my favorite nonfiction books of the year so far. It's called An Immense World: How Animal Senses Reveal the Hidden Realms Around Us by Ed Yong. In this book, the fantastic science writer Ed Yong breaks down what we currently know about different animal senses and how that creates a world for them that is entirely different from our own. This book is mind-blowing. You will look at animals in an entirely different way. You will see the world in an entirely different way after reading it. This is one that I think everyone should read. My first TBR book for display I selected because a floral arrangement can sometimes also be known as a floral display, like a display of flowers. I am planning on reading By Any Other Name, A Cultural History of the Rose by Simon Morley. And in this book, the author examines the human relationship with the rose over the centuries and just how much cultural meaning we have attached to these flowers. My mom really loves to grow roses, so this pick is partially inspired by her. My second selection for display is also my final TBR pick for Nonfiction November, and that is Garlic and Sapphires by Ruth Reichel. This is one of the several memoirs written by the food writer. This one is all about how when she accepted a job as a restaurant critic for the New York Times, she had to start going to these restaurants while wearing a disguise because everyone knew what she looked like when she accepted the job, and she wanted to be treated just like anyone else. She wanted to be able to actually review the restaurant and not be given special treatment. So she went in disguise, which is why I thought of the word display when I thought of this book. But now that I think about it, this book could also apply to the fraud challenge, since I guess technically she was being deceptive. In any event, this was one of the 23 nonfiction books I wanted to make a point of reading in 2023, and I actually read the early chapters of this one during last year's Nonfiction November. I really enjoyed what I read, and I can't wait to dive into the rest. So there you have it. Those were my recommendations and my own TBR picks for each of our challenge words. I hope you enjoyed hearing my interpretations. If you want to go with those in selecting your own books, please feel free. But if you want to take it in an entirely different direction, please feel free to do that as well. Creativity is encouraged. This is your Nonfiction November. Please shape it however you choose. All you need to do is remember to read at least one nonfiction book during the month of November, and you will be a part of this annual nonfiction celebration. If you want more recommendations, if you want to talk to other readers, please do connect with the event across social media. The links to all of our profiles will be linked for you in the description box below. You can also use and search the hashtag Nonfiction November to share what you're planning on reading and also see what everyone else is planning on picking up. And also feel free to use this comment section as a resource. Share your own recommendations for the challenges. Share what you're planning on reading during Nonfiction November so that we can all start to get hyped about the great reading month to come. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.